Okay, Madam President, we're ready.
Thank you and good evening. I now call this tax rate hearing and board workshop to order at 6:33 p.m. on September 26th, 2023. May I get a motion and a second to approve the agenda?
Move to approve the agenda as presented.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carries. Item 2.01, tax rate hearing.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Chris Olzer. I'm the CFO here at the Maplewood-Richmond Heights School District. And this evening, we are here to present to you the proposed tax rates for the 2023 tax year, which will cover the 2024 fiscal year. Some of the things we'll be discussing tonight are the sources of funding for MRH, what all those sources are. The new assessed values, this being 2023, this is a reassessment year. So the values have changed and we'll discuss that. We'll talk for a few minutes how the tax rate is actually calculated, what all goes into that. We'll look at the historical rates as well as the proposed rates for the next tax year, and then the projected revenue that those rates will then generate. So much like our financial statement presentations each month at the board meeting, we like to demonstrate a slide that shows the various funding sources for the school district. Maplewood-Richmond Heights relies quite heavily on our local tax revenues. You can see here, our local source revenues are about 86% of the budget, and the majority of that is directly from our community and the taxes generated by their property. Again, this is a reassessment year, so you can see here on the residential side that the assessed valuation, the adjusted assessed valuation increased about $44.3 million, which is just under 18%. The commercial assessed valuations increased $14.7 million, which is a little over 17%, for a total of 17.7% overall. Personal property, those numbers get pulled out as new property so that they're not assessed twice in this year. So that number will remain at zero, but the average increase in overall property values across all property classes is 15.3% for this year. So how do we arrive at the tax rate that we'll be presenting here in a few minutes? We take that total assessed valuation, or AV, that comes from the county assessor via the county collector. And I will say this year, we did reschedule our tax rate hearing. We did receive an update late in the game that caused us to need to go in and recalculate our rates, which does take just a little bit of time. So we do appreciate everyone's patience as we work through that process and rescheduling this meeting. But the odd year being a reassessment year, those properties are reassessed, not to be confused with reappraised. Those are different processes. So properties are reassessed and those values are then passed along to us. We have this thing called the Hancock Amendment, and the purpose of that is it governs the amount of increase that we can realize as a result of increased assessed values. So it's a little tricky, but our tax revenue in a reassessment year is limited to the lower of either the growth in our assessed values, which we've already discussed is about 15.3%, or the consumer price index, CPI, inflation, is at 6.5%. So therefore, the third factor there is 5%. So 5% being the lower, that is the maximum amount of revenue that we can realize as a result of the reassessments. So while you just heard me say that the residential property rates assessed valuation have increased just about 18%, we're only able to receive 5% increase as a result of that, and that's due to the Hancock Amendment. So all of the rates that we calculate are reduced to fit within that 5% threshold. Once we're through here, we will submit our rates to the county, who will then submit them to the auditor for certification. Once those are approved and those rates are, once those rates are certified, then they will go on the books, and those property tax bills will go out to families in November. And then December marks that point where folks start paying those property tax bills, and then the school district will begin to realize those revenues about mid-December. So until then, the property taxes that we receive are either delinquent or are delinquent taxes from the prior year. So for the most part, we're living off our fund balances until December, when we get the majority of those tax receipts in. So here are the rates in St. Louis County. We use the multi-rate method. We won't get into the ins and outs of that, but that does mean that we assess each property class separately. So residential rate proposed for the coming year is 3.4537. Commercial rate at 3.9992. Personal property again at 5.4658. And then a debt service levy of $1.35. All of that results at a 3.8321 blended rate. The blended rate is only used for DESI reporting and also for us to allocate our taxes to the various funds. That's not the rate that our community is charged. That's just a rate we use. All the other counties use a blended rate, but St. Louis County does use that multi-rate method. So you can see the resulting residential rate is 4.8037, commercial rate at 5.3492, and personal property 6.8158. And that's a result of the additional debt service levy of $1.35. So below the operating levy, we throw a lot of terms out during these types of meetings. So it's important, I think, that not just the board, but also our community understand what some of this terminology is. So our operating levy, that levy generates the revenues that we'll use to operate for our general fund, our teachers fund, and our capital projects. So everything except for paying the principal and interest on our bond debt. That's what we use the debt service levy for. That debt service levy is a separate levy that's assessed in order for us to pay the bonded indebtedness of the school district that has been previously voted on by our community, by our voters. And then the blended rate, again, we use for DESI reporting and to allocate those revenues as they come on to our books. Let's compare the proposed rates for tax year 23 to the prior year 22. And you can see here that the rates did decrease. And that is a function of the Hancock Amendment, because of the previous slide we discussed that 5% is the maximum. So after those adjustments, you can see that we dropped the residential levy, inclusive of debt service, about 40 cents. Commercial levy, just a little over 61 cents. And the blended rate is at 37.48 cents. We also like to take a look at the historical rates over time. So I'm showing you back to 2016, which was the last time we passed a tax levy. So you can see here that the rates have fluctuated, but overall, there has been a decline in the tax rates. And that's because, again, due to Hancock, the assessed values have increased. So therefore, the values that we are charging against those assessed values decrease to generate roughly the same amount of revenue, adjusted for inflation, of course. Then we'll take a look here at how our rates compare to those around. And you can see, I always like to put the assessed values of those other districts. The tax levies that are being assessed don't necessarily mean a whole lot unless you put it in context of the assessed valuation. So you can see a Lindbergh is at $2.75, but they're assessing or charging against $1.9 billion in assessed valuation. In contrast, MRH is charging against a $441 million assessed valuation. So you can see that market difference there And also, once the rates you see here are tax rate ceilings, districts also can ask their voters to increase past those tax rate ceilings. And again, that will also skew where we fall in line in the county. So don't need to put a whole lot of time and energy into figuring out why this is the way it is, but this is how we rate against the other rates that have been proposed and will be proposed before October. So what does all that generate as far as revenue for the operations and debt payments for the district? So here we're estimating 16.6, almost $16.7 million for operations, $5.8 million for debt service, which is just a little bit better than we had budgeted back in June at 16.66, and debt service is 6.1. You can see that that's just about a $30,000 increase on the operations side, a decrease on the debt service side of $241,000. And again, the debt service levy is set at a rate to generate the amount of money the district needs to pay its principal and interest payments plus a reasonable reserve. So that number does not change in relation to the assessed value numbers like the operating levy would. So you can see the increase over the prior year, about $800,000 on the operations side and a little over $700,000 on the debt service side for a total increase for the 23 tax year, the 24 fiscal year of $1.5 million, assuming a 98% collection rate, which is pretty typical for our area. We've ranged anywhere from 99 all the way down to 97, but the average is right around 88 to 88.3% on collection rate. Of course, we never know until the year is over, but I'm confident that that 98% is achievable. That is the end of the presentation, so I'm happy to take any questions from the board at this time.
Thank you for the presentation, Chris. Appreciate the intricacy of this work. So just to put a finer point on it, our individual community members may be feeling something that feels different than a decrease in the rate, right? Because individual properties across St. Louis County and definitely in Maplewood and Richmond Heights have increased in value, and we don't have anything to do with what the assessed valuation is. And even though there's a lesser tax rate, when the total amount of your property value is greater, you're going to see a larger tax bill. Is that a correct characterization?
That is correct. And the Hancock Amendment here is in play, just as it is in any other capacity here. So yeah, the tax levy or the tax rate does decrease as the assessed valuation increases, but yes, the typical taxpayer will see a higher dollar amount on their bill this year as a result of that reassessment, of course, limited by the Hancock Amendment.
Thank you.
Are there other questions or need for clarifying statements?
I do.
Oh, go ahead, Katie.
Okay, I was going to say, I do have a question about the 98% collection rate assumptions. I'm curious to know, and thank you for sharing the historical range that has looked like. I am wondering if that is something we need to, seek some additional information from the county or from neighboring districts on. I am wondering, obviously we've had several years of individual community member financial strain, and just, again, appreciate that our community by and large pays their taxes, but wondering if we might see more delinquency in, this current market.
We do in reassessment years see a little bit higher delinquency rate, but it really hasn't over these last few years, really hasn't been anything to be concerned about. And the thing about delinquent rates is at some point those taxes do have to get paid. And they do come in prior years, but it is worth mentioning. Another thing that we'll see is there'll be in reassessment years, we'll typically see a higher protest rate as folks appeal to the tax commission to lower those assessed values for whatever reason. Sometimes they're successful, sometimes not. But the majority of those we'll see on the commercial side, but we have started to see them on the residential side with the market increase in assessed values over the last couple of assessment years.
I think we can also expect that to continue now that, at least in Maplewood, our city hall has stepped in to support seniors in appealing their assessed values. And that is I expect a program that the city will continue to support.
Chris, can we go back to page 11 on the presentation and just walk me through where are we at ultimately when this is all said and done? I see, of course, that our estimated tax revenue versus our original, there's a slight increase, but our debt service, I think I said that backwards. There's a slight increase to operations and a big decrease to debt service, but how does that affect our budget and our budgeting process and any windfalls or shortfalls that are going to occur?
Chris, you're still on mute.
Sorry about that. I was saying some good stuff too. So luckily for the homeowner, the resident, or the commercial proprietor that's paying these taxes, the Hancock Amendment is in place to protect them so that we don't receive a windfall. As a matter of fact, that's some of the terminology that we do use in these circles, is to keep a windfall from occurring. On the debt service side, like I mentioned before, the assessed value increases, but the $1.35 stays the same to generate the amount of money we need. So if we were to leave that $1.35 in place and we were to decrease the assessed valuation, that would generate less revenue. If we increase the AV further, that would increase the amount of revenue. It doesn't work that way with the operating levy. The operating levy scales and is governed by that Hancock Amendment of 5% or lower. So that's why those two numbers will vary. You may remember from last year, there was also a slight decrease on the debt service because our levy did decrease from where we had projected when we budgeted. Remember too, that when we set our budget, we're going off preliminary numbers from the county that often swing wildly when it comes to the post Board of Equalization numbers that we get in September. So the numbers can vary a little or a lot. We've seen both, but that is the reason why you see those variances. But you also heard me say on the debt service side that we are allowed to assess enough to generate revenue to pay our principal and interest on the coming bonds, on the bonds for this coming fiscal year, and also a reasonable reserve for the next. So we do have a reserve in place. So this $240,000 decrease is not consequential or material to the budget.
Whoops. I think what I'm most interested in is how it affects the school's operating budget specifically.
With this increase of being projected increase right around $30,000, it really doesn't. The numbers that you've been seeing on the last 2 months' financial statements, as well as the budget that you approved in June, $30,000 isn't enough to move the needle on the fund balance. So the only way that we can adjust that fund balance is, at this point, is to either increase the revenue or decrease the expenses. I hope that speaks to the question better.
Chris, can you be more specific about how one would increase the revenue if that did need to occur?
Sure. On the operations side, we would need to increase the tax levy by way of a vote of the people. There's only two mechanisms through which we can increase the levy past the calculated ceiling for that particular tax year. And that is either through a vote of the people or a process called recoupment, whereby we can go back into prior tax years and look for closed tax commission cases that would have decreased the assessed valuation. We're able to go back and one time capture that lost revenue. There is a little bit of that out there. So recoupment is something that we'll look at for the coming tax year, but not on this current one. So other than that, those are the only two ways that we can generate more revenue from property taxes. The only other way is to do a voluntary rollback, which some districts do. If they have a tax rate ceiling that is generating more revenue than they need to pay their bills, they'll roll that back. We are not currently in that situation. So we would be looking at increases either by a vote of the people or a recoupment.
And just for the community work around debt services and our current bonds, if you can address that as well.
Sure. We typically, in looking at the debt schedule, we pay off anywhere from $4.2 to $4.6 million of debt each year. When remember back in 2020, June of 2020, we did pass a bond issue that generated $30 million in revenue for the construction projects that you probably are tired of seeing going on around our campuses, but that is how those were generated. We do have other bonds on the books that we are paying off, and that debt service revenue will go towards those, and plus a little bit of extra to have in case of rainy day.
If we have no additional questions, we'll move on to the public hearing portion of the meeting. If there are members of the public who wish to make comment as part of this meeting, I ask that you raise your Zoom hand and we will unmute you in the order that you raise your hand to give comment. No Zoom hands, I'm assuming, Chris?
I don't see any Zoom hands.
Okay. Well, we do appreciate our community attending this meeting and participating. If there are follow-up questions, of course, you are encouraged and welcome to send those to the board and to the superintendent together. So with that, we will move on to our action item. Can I get a motion and a second for approval of the tax rate?
Move to approve tax rate for 2023 as $3.4537 for residential real estate, $3.9992 for commercial real estate. I'm not saying this right, excuse me, and $5.4658 for personal property, $1.35 for debt service to be allocated by the blended fund rate by fund as $3.7321 to the incidental fund, 10 cents to the capital products fund, and $1.35 to the debt service fund.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carries on approval of the 2023 tax rate. May I have a motion for adjournment?
Move to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Meeting is adjourned at 6:58 p.m. and we will see everyone on Thursday for our roundtable event. Thank you.